Okay, so we were 2/3 of the way through our do's and don'ts, so let's jump right in and get to our third don't. It's all, well, no, some of them are do. Many of them don't. Okay, no, they're all do's, really, I guess. Okay, yes. Okay, the harmony among contracts, and this is something I have mentioned several times, and we will see it again and again. As you know, the family of contracts, the web of documents that you may find in a deal may be created by people who have no idea of one another's existence. They may not at all have the big picture. They may hardly have a good picture on their own little piece of the puzzle. When you leave today, at least you will be well aware that this fact exists. There's the web. A lot of people in it might not realize they're part of a web. They're like, we just do it this way. We have this is this thing. And what you don't want, and this is one of the things I was talking earlier with someone about, is to have one document, like a letter of credit, that has a different Incoterms rule in it than the contract of sale. Now, sometimes, again, you're going to find yourself in a situation that you did not create, that you cannot drive, you can't steer the bus, but at least you know what you would like to have happen. And if you find yourself in a situation with documents that don't quite match up, you know, the invoice says this. I've had people come, where was I, in Singapore a few weeks ago, and a lovely young woman came up and told me about how they had 2 different Incoterms rules in the same sale contract. And I was like, what do you know? So these don't work, right? But if you do find yourself in a situation like that and you can't fix it right then, you will know better for the next time, and importantly, you will be able to anticipate or think about some of the risks or where things might start to people speaking different languages kind of thing, and be ready for it if it were to happen, or to try to take some proactive, like, look, you guys have this in your LC, but we've got this in our sale contract. Can we figure out a practical way through something like that? So, right, and the sale, for our purposes, for Incoterms rules purposes, the sale contract is the one you want to start with if you're starting from a blank slate. Buyer and seller have agreed to a sale contract for the sale of goods incorporating the following Incoterms rule. Please, everybody, take note, okay? As I say, not a perfect world. We can't always control everything, but at least be aware. And there is, I apologize for this. This is my very primitive PowerPoint skills. Usually I have my interns who tend to be very young and very skilled at all these technical things, do things. And I have this wonderful young intern who actually knows something about finance. And I told him I want something sort of like this, like with sale contract, like visually, you can't miss it. And he came back to me with these beautiful, intricate, like he doesn't really know about Incoterms, so he had just gone crazy, and they were just too complicated. So anyway, at the last minute, I created this. The point is, if you look at nothing else, you just see sale contract, Incoterms rule. That at least, I hope, will stick in your mind. Okay, now, I have talked about how wonderful the introduction is, and it really is. And one of the things we say in the introduction, and you can read about it, I think it's the last paragraph of the introduction, or you can just listen to me now and know in your heart that it is right from your own experience. You may have lived through it. Yes, it is indeed the last paragraph of the introduction. Caution, it says, big letters, caution with variance. Now, to back up from that, though, that we are in the world of freedom of contract. These are private contracts. People are choosing or not to use the Incoterms rules in them. There's no mandatory law in the Incoterms rules. When you two private parties enter into a contract, do as you will, aside from mandatory laws where you can't do terrible things to people and things. But so the point is, you are free to vary whatever you want, right? You can write whatever you want, pretty much. But be careful, because people sort of go halfway with this. They say, great, we have an Incoterms rule. We understand that we want to make a little shift. Let's just toss a couple of words in there that will show that. And the prime example, for those of you that ever have the misfortune perhaps to work with XWorks, not a favorite rule of ours, even though it exists, is XWorks loaded. Some of you may have come upon this. When we go through the rules individually, we'll talk about some of the problems with XWorks, and I'll give you a preview now. It is all the way on the least, it is the least seller obligation. So people will use it because they say, well, I'm selling, I want the least obligation. And essentially it's the come and get it. You know, I put the goods outside on my doorstep of my warehouse, come and, you know, pick up the phone, send an email, come and get them. Okay, so let's imagine, and that's it. That's what the seller has to do. The seller does not have to load the goods onto the arriving, the collecting vehicle. Now, in real life, this often makes no sense, right? It could be that the goods require some kind of specialized machinery to move them from one place to another, and the seller has that machinery, but the buyer does not. It may be that you are the premises, the seller's premises, where the goods are being put at the disposal of, will not allow, it's got a perimeter, it's a work site, who knows what. Does insurance allow for somebody else's truck to drive across? There are situations where it's just not going to make any sense. And then even if it's literally possible, it may well not make sense. Okay, one of the reasons that we at ICC don't really like Xworks, but people are smart, and they use it, Xworks, and they realize the things I've just said about the problems with loading, and so they decide between themselves, seller and buyer, okay, Xworks, but the loading thing's always really weird. Let's say Xworks loaded. Okay, that's a really, really common one. And so let's imagine, you say, well, that's nice, you're allowed to vary. Yes, of course you're allowed to do as you like. So you put Xworks loaded, and it's happening, the loading is happening, and something goes wrong during the loading and the goods are damaged. Who pays for that? Whose risk is that? Did the parties actually think that through and allocate the risk? Maybe not, often not, right? And so then you get into a situation, let's assume you don't have to go before an arbitral tribunal, it doesn't rise to that level. The seller's going, well, I was just trying to do you a favor, I'm trying to help you here, you know, and the buyer's like, yeah, but you're so clumsy, and look, and it's crazy, and delivery shouldn't happen until the goods are loaded, and the seller says, well, we didn't write that in the contract. My point is, it's a very common variation, one can see the logic behind it, it can be done very well, but what's missing is, if you simply write Xworks loaded, you have not explained, do you mean that delivery risk passage doesn't happen until the goods have been loaded? Maybe that's what you mean. Maybe it's not what you mean. Who's going to pay for the loading? So these are the kinds of things, and this is, I'm just using this simple, common example. If you're going to vary the rules, and it may make perfect sense for you to do it, have that conversation first, actually. Think a little bit about what might happen. Have I dealt with risk? Have I dealt with cost? Has the delivery point possibly changed? You don't want uncertainty. Traders, nobody. But the world of international trade, you're looking to reduce uncertainty. You're always trying to pin things down. This goes back to, for example, we said when you put the named place of delivery or destination, be as specific as possible. Reduce the circle of uncertainty. So variations, if you must, but be careful, be careful, be careful. Oh, look at a mini quiz. Okay, just a show of hands, or you can shout out, how many Incoterms rules contain insurance obligations? Two, yay. Okay, great. Which ones? I have to make this mini quiz harder next time. Who is obliged to contract for insurance? Seller, I hear it, thank you. And what level of cover? Okay, it's changed. I can hear that you're forming the words. This has changed. It used to be that both CIP and CIF had the minimum level, the C clauses level. Now CIP is a more all-risk level, a clauses A kind of level. So, yay, mini quiz. Okay, now let's see where we are. Oh no, I'm doing my thing. Okay, well, we can talk. Is there some way to, great, thank you. Thank you so much. I know, is it just mine? Isn't it weird? It's like it works and then it doesn't work. Okay, so we can, thank you. Look at that. Okay, okay, another one of my preachy sort of slides. All right, this gets back to what I said this morning about what is it that you will be able to do when you leave here that perhaps you were not as familiar with when you arrived. When you get back, your boss said, I let you go for a whole day. What have you learned? The point is, and this also gets to the point of you're not trying to memorize what we're talking about here. That is not what I'm about. You're going to get these slides. You have the book. You are privileged enough to know that there is a book, to know that inside the book are the answers to many of your questions. And so we're going to talk now about how to apply what's in this book, how to find what you need in this book. And we've done a little bit of that already, and we're going to keep doing that in a sort of measured way so that when you are faced this job, next job, 1,000 years from now, you're sitting next to the most fabulous person at dinner and you want to impress them, you can talk about how great you are at navigating the Incoterms rules. This is the slide we already saw. I'm just trying to bring our minds back to the notion that we've got the two categories of rules. Problems often arise using maritime where they shouldn't be or are not ideal, either are literally impossible because there's no ship or there's a container, and we really suggest that you be careful because you are going to have that weird period of risk that the seller still has between dropping them off at the terminal and the time they get on board the vessel. And then we also, this is just a review also of how each of the 11 is set up in this, has the same skeleton, the same bone structure of A1, B1 through A10, B10, and how that order has changed, and how, again, I will say, often the critical thing, if you want to know a single thing about a rule, it is where is delivery, and what is it, what do you have to do, what does seller do to deliver, okay, and that's going to be found in A2, B2. I also told you about A3 and B3 that follows, obviously A2 and B2, and it's about risk, delivery and risk. They are intimately tied together. They are so intimately tied together that if you go to A3, you will see that all it does is tell you to look at A2 to see if the goods have been delivered, okay? And then we've got another one sort of like this. This I think is a useful one. This is actually, it's really sort of the first one, but bigger. And the point is, I've bolded some of the words. What's in the parentheses, the insert da 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 da, is really important, and we're going to see how particularly in the C rules, there are 4, right? There's CPT and CIP in the multimodal, and there's CFR and CIF in the maritime, how what you're putting in those parentheses for the C rules can be a source of confusion and can be a source of things you want to watch out for. So this also shows you, let's just look through. So just reading down from the left, down from X-Works, insert named place of delivery, insert named place of delivery, suddenly something changes. Insert in the C terms, something changes, and you can see it here. You'll see it in a variety of ways, but you can see it immediately here. Insert named place of destination, okay? Same for CIP, insert named place of destination. That continues in the D rules, right? That we're moving from least seller obligation to most seller obligation, and we can see the same thing in the maritime rules in a smaller way. We have FAS, insert named port of shipment, same for FOB. Well, 2 things to note here, port and shipment, and then suddenly in the C rules, suddenly, where is our port of shipment? It is now the named port of destination, okay? So that is something to take note of. There's something that I wanted to raise now. I don't have a slide for it, but luckily we have our books. And I've made a note to myself to amend my slide about the different kinds of things we've done to make the book easier to read. This is a big one. This is a great thing that we've added here, and I'm saying this because I've already gotten a lot of feedback about it. What we've done, the front of the book with those little black half circles, remember how I kept saying, open to the book to anywhere in the front and you see the half circles? Some of you may have been asking yourselves, well, what's in the back of the book? Why are you not telling us to go there? Where did those little circles go? we have created an annex. Okay, the first part of the book is set up just the way 2010 was. X works, followed by F, the whole rule, the guidance note and all the rule, A1, A2, A3, like that. During the revision process, we on the drafting group, we were trying to manage so many interwoven comments and so many issues. Like we'd say, okay, let's change this part, this article of this rule, and then we'd think, well, there's going to be implications for the other rules in that same article. So for ourselves, as a tool to help the drafting group, we created a document that we called the article by article document, where we took all the A1s and listed them all in a row, all the B1s, so that we would have, depending on the issue, so if we made a change in A7 of CPT, I'm just making this up, we would say, well, what other kinds of changes? Well, let's see all the different languages. Oh yes, that's going to have to change, that can say the same. So we have an annex. So if you go to the book and you find where the little circles stop and the little CIF, I'm down, that's the last one, find where the little half circles stop, and then immediately you will find something that looks like this. It is the article by article annex, and it's really helpful. Why is it helpful? Well, even if you don't want to get into reading in detail, you can see certain things right away. So remember earlier I told you how we considered getting rid of A1 and B1, which basically say someone provides the goods, the other person pays for it. And then I said, well, we didn't get rid of it, but you'll see that it's the same for every rule. You can, if you open to this annex, just quickly skim with your eyes, and indeed, you'll see, I was right. Look, the same for all the rules, and then B1 is right after, and it's the same. Okay, that's fine, but not particularly interesting. But then, lo, we get to delivery. And here again in the annex, you need not read a single word. You can see maybe even from this distance, X works, one little paragraph. FCA, there's a lot in the delivery provision, right? So you can see that it's an easy fix, right? If your brain is tired of reading through each rule and trying to remember where I am, or if indeed you're trying to choose a rule, or if indeed you're just trying to figure out where is the delivery point, all I want is to look at this one article without having all this other stuff around, you can do it this way. In that spirit, and as a preview of something we're going to talk about, could I ask you to go to the annex? I want to look at the carriage contract provisions. The carriage articles are A4, B4. Could you please go to the annex, and we're going to go to A4 in the annex, which looks like this. And why am I doing this? Because this gets back to this slide where you're going along and you're reading insert name place of delivery, insert name place of delivery, and suddenly name place of destination. That kind of thing that kind of pattern can be helpful, even if it's not for the specifics, right? There are lots of ways to carve up the rules, to think of them maritime, non-maritime, lease seller obligation to most, where's delivery, who pays for what. So in the carriage articles, let's just look at the first few words of each of the Article 4s. Okay, I'm starting with X works. Seller has no obligation to make a contract of carriage. FCA, seller has no obligation to make a contract of carriage. CPT, suddenly something changes. Seller must contract. Okay, so we can see just that in that quick little thing, suddenly, whoa, seller suddenly, once you get to the C rules, has to do something, okay? And seller must contract, we see it in CIP, we see it in the D terms, right? The seller has to contract, DDP, seller must contract, FAS, seller has no obligation. Wait a minute, what happened? What happened is we had all the multimodal terms, and then suddenly FAS, we reset to the F terms and the maritime terms. So does that rule still hold? FAS, seller has no obligation to contract. FOB, we turn the page. CFR, sure enough, suddenly the seller has to contract again. Okay, so we see that, you can see the trends there, you can sort of feel them in a different way. I want to stick with CFR, here we are. Okay, we're at CFR. A4, this is the preview. I'm about to point something out that will come back later, but we can start having it in the back of our heads now. Cost and freight, this is the carriage provision. Who has to contract for carriage? The seller must contract or procure a contract, that's a string sales thing, for the carriage of the goods, okay, let's pay attention, from the agreed point of delivery, if any, at the, if any, at the place of delivery to the named port of destination, okay? Port of destination. We saw it here. We saw that in the maritime terms, you insert the name port of destination, and I'm hitting that word port, and I'm hitting the fact that it's in the carriage obligation for something that we're going to talk about later, okay? So the sea, and also to highlight the variety of little weird things about the sea rules that make them a particularly rich terrain for people to get confused. I've had people in 2-day master classes where we go through detailed case studies in small groups, like a maximum of 15 people in the whole room, and still at the end of day 2, and they know the rules, like they're one of these people that really likes to think about it. Sometimes they still will make this mistake of who's paying, who has the risk, what's named, is that the point of delivery? So the sea rules have a number of things. Note just this word port and put that in the back of your head. Okay, so let's turn away from this. Let's talk more, pull the camera back again, more process related. Excuse me. Can I do magic? Last time it worked, right? Didn't it work? But you did last time, it was like 70 minutes. Okay, well, what we're about to do is to go through a system that I did not make up. And I asked earlier who was a lawyer in the room, and that it was partly because it's something that, at least in the US, when you study law, we have a system of common law, and so a lot of what you're studying is decisions by judges, and judges, like lots of people who write and talk for a living, tend to write very long opinions. And so as a law student in the US, you are given basically a volume of things to absorb and understand and learn that is not possible to do. It's just the volume is part of the test of it, it's too much. And so what they teach you early on, and this is applicable, what they teach you is a way to be faced with a big sort of floppy bunch of information and to just distill what it is that's really important about it. And it's invaluable when you're faced with a huge amount of information, but it's also really helpful. And I realized this gradually over the years when I would get Incoterms questions, that it's really helpful to have a kind of systematic way to make sure quickly that you can figure out what it is you're really focusing on. And part of the reason you need to do that, and I think we've seen it here even in some of the questions about the rules, or maybe not here, but we've seen it, one sees it in life. The people asking the questions sometimes have not, either they're not familiar with the rules, so they don't have the tools to figure out what they're asking, or they have kind of a general sense of what their question is. Anyway, I will get questions that are filled, they're long, they're complicated, they're filled with all kinds of details and pieces of information, and they're being sent to me by someone who thinks they have an Incoterms related question, right? And I have, especially in the beginning when I was becoming familiar with this, I would be combing through all these facts, trying to figure out what is the actual question here, and then is it an Incoterms rules question? Because if you strip away, you have some complicated bunch of words in front of you and you strip it away and what they're really asking is, has title transferred, you will know, oh, well, that's not an Incoterms rules question. But the first step is to find out what is the issue, right? And you'll see when we get to the case studies, which are drawn on real life questions, sometimes the question, I mean, we've pared them down so they're pretty understandable, but there's a certain level of kind of, the festive pageant of life going on. So someone picks up the phone and calls you, someone writes you an email, someone comes into your office and they start talking to you, there's something that's making them uneasy, or even it's you thinking about an Incoterms rule thing. what is the actual issue? What are they asking? Is it who pays for something, right? Sometimes the question is really simple, who pays for this? Or is it more general? Is it really, has risk passed? Is it something about goods have been damaged? Does someone have to replace them? So, right, you need to find the issue that correlates to one of the things in the book. And so that's the first thing, is to find the issue. What are you being asked? Or what is the right question to ask? Someone might want you to help them analyze something. You say, well, what's the heart of it all, you know? And that's partly why we talk about delivery so much. A lot of questions are sort of put to the side if you know the delivery answer. You don't really need to start worrying about the details of X or Y if you know that you no longer have risk or you've done your part under that. Okay, then, so that sometimes is the hard part, sometimes not so much. What is the issue? Then, and this is where knowing what the book looks like and the slides of like articles 1 through to A1 through A10, B1 through B10 are useful. Where do I find the answer? If it's really simple, like who has responsibility for export clearance under X rule, well, let me think, or let me just open the book, or let me look at that slide that has the list. You know which provision to look at. So if you can get to those 2 points, you're way ahead of the game. But then comes the part, and we'll see this in the case studies, whatever we have time for, and there will be the case studies in the slides that are sent to you. So if we don't get through many of them, that's fine. You can reflect on them at your leisure. It's where the rubber hits the road, if I may, applying the law to the facts. It's like someone said to me, when we were talking about this on the break at one of, not this training, a different one, it's like, I don't know if you guys have kids, but you take, you know how when you go to an amusement park, and also last night on TV there kept being these advertisements for a new amusement park, an international level standard amusement park with all rides from all over the world is going to open on the 1st of November. Perhaps if you watch TV you know this. Anyway, some of those rides, you can't be too short to go on them because you won't fit into all the protective whatever. I don't like those rides. And so there will be a sign saying only people who are, you know, I don't know, 2 feet high or whatever height. So that's the rule. And then if you're standing there with your child and the issue is this child allowed to go on this ride? And you take the rule and you apply it to your facts and you say, how tall are you? Oh, you're 2 feet, yes, or no, you're 1 foot, no, you can't go on the ride. I mean, it's that kind of exercise where you have the kind of messy, exciting reality of life and this clinical piece of language, and then you put the two together and see what you can do with it all. So we're gonna just run through a couple together. So, okay, here we go. So, I've been forecasting this one. I'm selling under Incoterms 2020 rule DAP. I like that. They use the word rule. I like the word rule for Incoterms, and they say what version. And the buyer says that I'm responsible for arranging export clearance. Do I have to pay for the cost of export clearance? Now, another thing that you will be able to do after you leave here today that maybe you wouldn't have been as easily able to do is if someone is asking you this question, and often they're asking you because they're trying to push their view of things, you know, well, certainly I'm the buyer, of course I don't have to pay for this. You can, without getting into a fight, you can just sort of, well, actually, here is the language that answers your question. So here we are. So there's the question. Someone's on the phone, someone's standing in front of my desk asking me this. I'm like, oh, I don't know, I don't remember. I was only listening to 5% of what that woman was saying, that's fine. But it's okay because we look for the issue, okay, or issues. And so, obviously, it's all there in that last few words. Who has to pay for the cost of the export clearance? And so where might you look for that? And you can look in a couple of places. You can look in the dedicated article that deals with, and it will say, seller must pay for, bang, bang, bang. Or you could stumble upon the costs article, which is almost at the end of all the articles, sometimes a big laundry list, and it will be reflected in either of those two places. And then the application is, what does the rule really say, right? You look at the words, you have to be 3 feet high, you are 2 feet high, you can't go on the ride, whatever it is. And so here I have just typed out the language, but I've underlined, yes, seller must pay under DAP. Let me take a moment just to say, delivery, as I've said ad nauseum, is intimately and importantly tied to the passage of risk. It's also a general marker for two other things, not 100%, there are exceptions, but generally the seller will deal with and pay for export clearance, right, which is related to stuff usually, not always, that happens before delivery, and buyer for import clearance, and that makes sense, and costs. On a general level, and the B9, A9 and B9 of each of the rules say this, seller pays for things generally up till delivery and buyer after. So these are the language of the two provisions, and so here's another one. Okay, question. I'm buying under Incoterms 20 rule FOB. The goods were put on board the vessel. We know what that means, don't we? But the vessel has sunk in the middle of the ocean and the goods have been destroyed. Doesn't seller have to send me new goods? Like the way that's phrased, like, doesn't? Like, well, let's analyze it. And so you're faced with someone going like, no, I'm right. And you say, well, all right, let's slow down, let's think about it. What's the risk, right? The risk is, what's the issue? The issue is risk. And so we know A3, B3, but what we also know, okay, what do the relevant articles actually say? There's my school teacher background coming out. And so I've quoted the language here, right? But then in the middle, or sort of 2/3 of the way down, I say note, as I've already said before, and as you will know, you can do it by looking at the annex and just look at A3 all the way through. It just says, don't look over here, look at A2, have the goods been delivered? And there we see the answer that delivers the goods by placing them on board, okay? And we know that the goods were on board and then they were destroyed. Delivery had happened, risk had passed. No, seller doesn't have to send you new goods for free. Sorry, buddy. Okay, and then here, trick question is a little strong, but whatever, I'm making another point here. Who pays for terminal handling charges under the new Incoterms 2020 rules? Just for my information, who in the room, in whose daily life does the phrase terminal handling charges come up on a regular basis? Ah, okay, interesting. Okay, thanks. Thank you. I will, maybe when there are more logistics people in the room suddenly, this is a term of art. People will say terminal handling charges, and we get a lot of questions about who pays for terminal handling charges in this rule or that rule. Now, although that's a phrase, a grouping that you may come upon, it is not actually something that the Incoterms rules deal with. We thought about it when we were preparing 2010, and we said, well, we keep hearing so many questions, so many people refer to terminal handling charges as a category, maybe we can actually make a category out of it and assign who pays for it under which rule. It didn't take long for us to realize that when people use that phrase, they often meant a huge range of different things. So rather, for you guys, this doesn't sound like a very live issue. Obviously here the issue is costs, and you would look at the A9, B9 allocation of costs, and if you were just left on your own, you would be going like, Emily, I don't find the words terminal handling charges, what are you doing? And I would say, yes, I'm trying to teach. And the point is, you need to know what specific thing. Often when people refer to a category of terminal handling charges, if it's a bundle of different charges, there may be some pieces that are for one party and some for the other. Why? Because some of them may be tied to, for example, export clearance, even though they happen before delivery. So the point is you need to analyze them. And so if someone starts barging in onto your phone and saying, who pays for terminal handling charges under X, you say, well, slow down. List me the very costs and charges that you want to hear about. And then you can look at A9, B9, and other places to figure it out. Okay, this is just the review of the method that we will bring when we get to the case studies, or when you get to the real life case studies that make up our existence on this earth. Issue, article, apply it. Okay. What we're going to do now, and hang on, wait, I need to understand what time I'm working towards here. Okay, we have a coffee break at 1500. Oh, God. Oh, yes, we need a mic, though. You cannot talk without a microphone.
Pertaining to A2, delivery. FOB A2.
FOB A2,
A2,
yes.
You told us that you in fact told us a particular case in which a person under FOB delivered the container to the port, and actually it was not on board. Then what specifically, as per the new Incoterms, is there any banding now that he has to deliver the container on board the ship, or will he be free while delivering the container on the port only?
It's such a good question. It's such an interesting question because the rules are, I don't know if what I'm about to say is true. The rules are not trying to tell you what you must do. It is telling you that if certain facts are true, then other facts are not true. So FOB, you deliver, what it sounds like what we're talking about is a situation where maybe the parties have chosen the wrong rule.
The container on the port?
At the terminal or the
port authorities?
Yeah.
And you get the seal number on the container as well from the port authorities?
Right.
And being shipper or exporter or seller, you are now, you think you are free from your responsibilities?
Right.
The point we discussed in the morning. And something happened and it burned out or something like that.
Right.
It was not actually on board the vessel.
And therefore,
therefore
what?
It was who is responsible for the risk?
Well, we can answer that, right? We can analyze that. You say, well, it was not on board.
On board the vessel.
On board the vessel, exactly.
Yes.
We look at the requirements of A2 for delivery to have happened, and they have not been met. It has not been delivered. And therefore risk has not passed. So exactly, and you're saying we've delivered it to the port, you've handed it over to the port. That's why the word delivery has a sort of special.
So it will be considered as delivered on board the vessel?
It is delivered when whatever it says here, and for the maritime terms, it is delivered, or for FOB, CFR, and CIF, on board the vessel, right? And again, you may find people arguing with you and telling you things, and that's fine. You can point to language and say, as we just did in the analysis, was it delivered? Let's check. Let's double check. We feel like it was delivered. Now, having said that, well, I'll wait till we get to FOB to say this point. I don't want to confuse things further. Okay, so what we're going to do now, I've never been so filmed or photographed before. What we're going to do now is run through each of the rules and just sort of quickly walk through them. And some of the rules it's kind of like if we sat together and read each of the explanatory notes, actually, is what it's like. Just there's certain like warning, or certain trends that you will see, like how when we looked in the annex and we saw, oh, I see that it goes from seller has no obligation for carriage, and suddenly seller has lots of obligation. Or when we looked at the slide that had the bigger version of insert name point of delivery, and then that changed to destination, and the maritime had port. So we're going to see some more. It's just another way of looking at it. It's all a bunch of information. It will settle somewhere in your head later. Don't worry about it. And if it never does, you can always just pick up the book and sort of reorient yourself that way. Okay, so let's see. Okay, good. So what we've got here, I have two, and I think in almost everyone, two slides. The first is simply the top drawing in the guidance notes. So we can check ourselves. We can go to, you've got the beautiful introduction that you're all going to read. Then we have this marker that says, here come the rules. And you jump right in with XWorks guidance note. This drawing is the top drawing. And at the bottom is what insert named place of delivery. So this is a snapshot, and you can learn quite a bit from this snapshot. Now, let me take a moment, a cautionary note. I mentioned before that some of you may have access to, and your clients may have, charts about the rules that show, okay, here's who pays for what, and that sort of thing that is specific to that company or to that industry. The ICC also produces a wall chart that is based on these drawings. And when we were, just a bit of history, when we were putting together 2010, there was an assumption by my colleagues in the commercial publishing part of the department that they were like, okay, and you guys are going to make a wall chart too, and it's literally, you unfold it and hang it on the wall. It's a long and thin, and it just has that kind of information in a sentence or two. It's very much snapshotty. And they said, okay, for 2010, you guys are going to do a wall chart, right? And the experts on the drafting group, these really, very experienced experts, almost unanimously did not want to do a wall chart. Now, why? Because maybe you've heard this sort of cliche, a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing. That's what we find. If you give someone a shorthand little wall chart, they think, who needs that book? Who needs all those boring, legalistic sentences? All I have to do is read this wall chart, and that's all I need to know. No, not at all. All we could do, we tried to have no wall chart, but we lost that fight, but we did have a big disclaimer at the bottom. We have a wall chart also for 2020. It's better, it's a bit more, there's a bit more detail, but it's still got that big disclaimer. Wall charts and snapshot slides like this are useful teaching tools. They're very useful teaching tools, as we've discussed. Some people really learn visually, like just show me a picture, a picture is worth 1,000 words, whatever. But be careful. It may be that when you receive these slides emailed after the presentation, you want to share them with colleagues. From my point of view, that's totally fine, but just know in the back of your head that this, if they go, oh good, all I need is to pull out these 11 slides and I'm good. Maybe not, but that having been said, there's a lot in this slide, and we can see it. We know what it means. We can see that the tip of the iceberg has all this ice under the water, but what we can see that black square next to the blue house, that's the goods, right? And so that's the point of delivery. Remember, we talked about ex-works, very little seller obligation. You don't necessarily put them outside in the rain, but that's what this drawing is suggesting. You put the goods at the disposal of the buyer, and that orange truck, the orange or yellow, whatever, things are for the buyer. And you can see that the goods are not in the truck, right? They're sitting there, and then we get to that whole loaded question. I've had someone complain to me that the black box should be inside the blue house, because indeed, when you put the buyer on notice that the goods are at the disposal, you literally often are not going to just sit them outside in the weather. But just the look of it, the black against the blue background, it was too hard to see. Anyway, so we can see that. Then we see costs and risks. Okay, costs, we know where to look for those, A9, B9, articles, and risks, we know. Really what risk means is, have the goods been delivered? Okay, in this case, and in most cases, but not in the C rules. Okay, we're going to see that, not in the C rules, but in all the other cases, there is a harmony between where the costs and risks transfer. Now, there are exceptions to costs transferring. If someone hasn't done something, met an obligation, there may be exceptions, but generally, so we can see very quickly, like a snapshot, very little seller obligation. And then export formalities and import formalities, that's another problem with Ex-Works we'll get to in a minute. You see here they're blank. The color is blank. And then you've got that snapshot at the bottom of insert named place of delivery. Okay, so that's some information. Let's go one more slide. Will give us a little more information. And this is basically the arrow bullet points I have here are essentially the topics that are covered in the explanatory note, right? And so we know that this is in the any mode of transport category. The first 7 rules are. There's a little sentence on when delivery happens. Then we have alert, buyer loads the goods, right? Let me take this opportunity to say that starting in the preparation of 2010 and continuing more loudly, much more loudly, in the preparation of 2020 were calls from our network of national committees to get rid of Ex-Works entirely, to delete it. Again, my personal Emily O'Connor view is that would help a lot of people avoid mistakes, and I think it would actually be a good development, but our job as the drafting group, we took to be to reflect market practice, not to push market practice. And it's a fine line, sometimes very fine, like the warnings about using containers with the maritime terms. You know, can we say don't do it, or we say consider not doing it, or you're unwise if you do it. So, but be careful, right? Ex-works, be careful, and this is one of the big reasons why. Buyer pays for transport, buyer responsible for export, where applicable. You'll see if you look at all the import-export clearance, if you were to go to our fabulous new annex and look at all A7, B7, you'll see that all the way through they start with where applicable. Why do we say that? We say that because we want to highlight the fact that the rules are used and can be used for international trades, but also for domestic. And that's something that some people don't realize. We encourage people to use it for all, and so sometimes it is not applicable. There is no export-import clearance, so we say that where applicable, we're applicable. Okay, the next point is important, and it comes up a lot. This goes back to be as specific as you can when you incorporate the rules. Remember, we had DAP 123 street, ABC, Ville, import land, or whatever. If you can be that granular, terminal number X next to the tree with the thing in front of it, you know, if you can make a situation where there is no doubt, no, but I thought it was here, but I thought it was there, but, you know, but I told you it was there, but you didn't write it down. You don't want that, right? So you want to be as specific as you can, and where you're not, there is language in the rules that basically says, if you guys haven't figured out a particular point, seller gets to pick the place, okay, the point. And if you have a huge airport and a bunch of terminals, or a huge, I mean, there are situations where this could actually cost some money, or there's some storage until you can get it to the place. So you want to keep that in mind. And okay, so we didn't get rid of ex-works, right? We no matter how much some countries that shall remain nameless and I and others thought it would be helpful to users to get rid of it, it would certainly solve some problems. We content ourselves by saying, okay, use it for domestic things. No one has any obligation, seller has no obligation to do anything for export, because all the seller has to do is put the goods outside and say, there they are. That can be a problem if the goods do get exported later. Maybe the seller could have helped you, you know. So definitely, let's see, this is again me just speaking in a very blunt, personal way, saying, don't use ex-works, and if you do, use it, or if you must, use it for a domestic, not an international sale that has export-import clearance in it. Okay, FCA. Now, FCA, why are there two drawings? Emily, why? You said there'd just be one. Well, we can figure that out by, we already saw, remember how we looked in the annex at all the A2, B2s, and we could just see immediately X-Works was just this, and FCA was long with lots of things. And here's the explanatory note with the two drawings. FCA is the only rule that has two written options for delivery points. Okay, it's the only one. It makes it nice, flexible, solves some X-Works problems, but it also makes it, there is that subtlety, or whatever the right word is. Okay, and we can see visually, we have a little snapshot of the two different places, and one of them is, let's look at that drawing. The first one is FCA seller's premises, and I have a slide that spells this out in a minute, and the explanatory note says it. That's the first place. So you say to yourself, what am I going to do? What if you were ever to take X-Works away? What would I do? Well, you would use FCA seller's premises. But why? Why can't I just say X-Works loaded? Well, you can, but you have to be careful, and why not just use FCA seller's premises? Why? What problems does it solve? Where is the black box? Okay, the black box has been loaded. So FCA seller's premises is basically X-Works loaded. Okay, so if, you know, rather than work your way through all the implications of X-Works loaded, it was funny, I did a training in, it was the Bangkok one a few weeks ago, and a guy stood up at the end, or raised his hand and stood up and said, I want to make a proposal for Incoterms 2030. And I said, okay, this is what happened last time. Immediately, people have ideas for the next version, so I took out my pen. I said, tell me. And he said, I want to propose that you have a separate Incoterms rule called X-Works loaded. And I was like, dude, just use FCA seller's premises. Like, why would we do that? We're trying to go in the other direction. You don't need XWorks loaded unless you have a deep interest in nobody having any responsibility for export clearance, right? But here you go. So next time someone says XWorks to you, why don't you go, how about FCA seller's premises? Anyway, so then the standard division point between the seller and buyer obtains here, right? It's still a very early delivery point. Risk has passed very early, but at least the goods have been put onto the buyer's collecting vehicle. And then it's all for the buyer. Now, second delivery point in FCA is, I think we say, any other place. So A is seller's premises, like XWorks loaded, and the other is any other place. So it could be any other place. Usually, though, it's near, if there's a lot of transport, it's going to be near the seller's end. It's sort of, I don't want it at my premises, I just want it at the railway station down the street, or the port down the block, or whatever. And in that case, you can see, so I am seller, I'm taking the goods to the port or to the whatever airport or wherever I'm supposed to go with them. And look, I haven't unloaded them. I have put them at the disposal of the buyer. So that is written in the language here. And yeah, the coloring on the export and import is terrible in these slides. I need to change that. As I said earlier, the default rule that is violated only by XWorks at one end and DDP at the other, all the other rules, export clearances and formalities are for seller, import clearance and formalities are for buyer. Kind of makes sense, right? I mean, a rare occasion where it's intuitive. Okay, and what do you put in there? FCA insert named place of delivery, much like XWorks. Whoa, okay, yeah, so here again, I've just called out that there are these two delivery points at seller's premises and elsewhere, any other place. And here we have sort of a standard thing, any modes of transport. Buyer arranges transport. There's interesting language about how if commercial practice or at buyer's request, sometimes it's going to be easier for seller to arrange transport. That's something to know. I've heard people call it, I'm not suggesting you do this, but I've heard people call that FCA plus. I can get the seller to arrange transport. But the interesting part to me there is if commercial practice. And we heard a question earlier here, more of a banking kind of technical BL question, I think, or a SWIFT system question. The notion of actual realities in the world, commercial practice, transport by the usual route, packaging in the manner appropriate or usual for the kind of goods. This notion, this recognition in the rules that there is an interplay with the enormous variety of actual practice comes up in certain places. Now, one might say, doesn't that introduce uncertainty? You know, are you going to hire lawyers to sit around going, it's commercial practice? No, it isn't. Yes, it is. Whatever. Yes, there is that possibility, but it also pays a nod to the realities of what's going on in the ground. So here's an example of that, if commercial practice. Okay, this export-import division. Again, here, fifth bullet point, if no specific point named by the buyer, the seller gets to pick, right? Now, if you're the seller, maybe you like that. Maybe you don't, you purposely don't want to bring up the topic so that if there's ever a question, you get to decide. Of course, that opens the door to sort of strange behavior, and it also just wastes time on a possible conversation that you don't need to have had. So again, when you're naming your place of delivery or destination, be as specific as you can. Okay, and then new, we've already talked about whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. We have this new method we're going to test on the BL and the onboard bill of lading, and see if only the banks would just stop asking for it, then we wouldn't have to even go through that. Okay, now we're at the C terms. You might have noticed I talk a lot and I talk really quickly. I'm from New York, but I have learned the power of silence. That's why I went the C terms. And it's very hard for me to do that. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want in your mind that when a C term comes before you, a C rule comes before you, you take a moment and just think about the various things that that might or might not mean. Now, we can see a little bit here with the difference in the arrows going on costs and risks. Remember in the E and the F so far we saw that the orange and the blue changed at the same point for cost and risks. So what's going on here? What does this mean? What does that look like, that top one? Why is that arrow going all the way? What does that mean? Seller's paying for carriage. That's right. Thank you. And remember, we looked in the annex. Remember I said this is going to come back. We looked in the annex at A4 and we saw seller has no obligation, X works, seller has no obligation, FCA. Suddenly, seller must contract for carriage, starting in the C rules, right? Okay, that's nice. That's fine, right? That we're moving from least seller obligation to most. What's the big deal? The big deal is that the risk line does not match that. So what does that mean? That means that seller pays for, arranges for transport to the named, well, we'll get to that in a minute, place of destination, but does not have the risk of that transport. So if I as seller have made my contract of carriage as I must under A4 or arranged for the carriage under A4 to New York, and the ship sinks on the way to New York, risk has already passed. And we know it because of that. Well, what does that mean about delivery? I'm being silent so you can answer or not for effect. Delivery has happened, right? Thank you. Delivery has happened. So you're in a funny position where you have, as seller, arranged for carriage to New York, and not just arranged for it. Look at the bottom, insert named place of destination, right? So that contract would say CPT New York. Well, it would say DAP, it would say CPT 123 Street, ABC Road, New York 10028. But so then you would say, oh, CPT New York, well, if something happened before it got to New York, surely risk hasn't passed, right? It even says CPT New York. No, that's the mistake that people after 2 days in master classes, maybe this is a reflection on our teaching, still will sometimes reflexively make that mistake. This is another reason why I'm just saying C. If you have a C term, take a breath and think about what it means. You don't have to remember all the different weird things it might mean, but this is one of them, and this drawing is meant to help you with that. What else? Okay, that's good. And then here, mode or mode of transport. Note on C rules, destination is named place, not place of delivery. It just isn't. And it's weird, right? Because I don't know if any of you have heard kind of advice. I am not giving you this advice, but I have heard people give it to others. Sell C. Meaning if you're a seller, you like the C terms. You get to control the costs of carriage, right? You're not paying some markup for the buyer to arrange the carriage, and maybe you're using your own, ship or whatever it is. But you don't bear the risk for that, right? So it's a beautiful thing. Now, I am not giving you the advice sell C, but that piece of advice does exist, and what is the implication of it? It's sort of don't buy C, right? If something's really good for a seller, probably it's not as good for the buyer. Now you're the buyer in New York. I'm the seller here in Karachi. Now what do we have? CPT New York, right? So I drive to the port, the seller, and I put the goods on a ship, and the ship takes off. Does the buyer know that this has happened? How would the buyer know? Why would the buyer know? It doesn't say insert named place of delivery. It just says destination. All the buyer knows is that I need to somehow get the goods to New York. So the point of this is that delivery can happen at my choice of way and place and time, and I don't even have to tell the buyer. And so the buyer is sleeping peacefully in bed, unbeknownst to the buyer. The ship risk is with him or her. Not that he or she could do much about it anyway, but it would be good to know, right? Now, how can we get around this? This is one of the common sort of weird unfairnesses or strange inequities in the C rules, what could we do to get around it? As a drafting group, we considered, should we, for the C rules, instead of only requiring named place of destination, which tells me, the seller, where I have to get the goods to, should we also have insert named place of delivery? We decided not to do it, and we know that in some cases it's not possible. There may be goods being produced at different warehouses, and you don't know the day they need to be sent, which warehouse or which city they'll be coming from, and that, you just need to get them to New York from wherever. Yes, true, that is sometimes the case. But if you can, going back to our be as specific as possible, and especially if you're a buyer, right, you would be well advised to ask your seller to work with you to put as much information about when and where delivery will happen, because otherwise, as a buyer, it's just happened, suddenly risk passed, completely outside your control without you even knowing. So yet another of the kinds of things that the C rules can, little twists. And then the export, the penultimate bullet, export, import, breakdown as usual. And again, this point of if you aren't specific, and here it's quite dramatic, seller can make the decision. CIP is the same as CPT, except there's an insurance. It's been a while since we've picked up our books. Let's go to that annex at the end. Could you please find the A5 part of the annex, and remember it's towards the end of the book, and it looks like this. It's an even more, you can imagine what it's going to look like, and indeed it does. It's very short, A5, that deals with insurance, except when you get to CIP and then CIF, and it gets very long. And that's where we set out the 110% requirement for the insurance and this and that. And remember now that CIP has raised the insurance requirement. Otherwise, it's the same as CIP, yes, is the same as CPT, exactly. And you can see in the drawing there's an insurance line that is only blue because it's only for the seller. Hang on. I feel like maybe the word delivered you might be using still in have the goods reach the destination. Let's take a look. Excellent. Let's go to CPT. Now we're in the front of the book. Or you could do it in the annex. Either way, find CPT A2 and let's read together what it means. I will read it to you. CPT A2 delivery. The seller must deliver the goods by handing them over to the carrier, contracted in accordance with A4, or by procuring. And again, when you see procuring throughout the rules, it's talking about string sales. And then the agreed date and period. Handing them over to the carrier, right? So that's fine.
Once the goods have been delivered to the buyer in this way, the seller does not guarantee that the goods will reach the place of destination in sound condition.
Indeed. Where was that from the explanatory note?
No.
Or
I
from
just wanted to, Then who's going to do the insurance? It's not the seller, then it's the buyer. Somebody is going to do the insurance in CPT as well.
It's a very good question. In CIP, obviously, there's this partial, maybe full insurance. In CPT, as in all the other rules except CIP and CIF, that's up to the parties. Usually someone's insuring. Sometimes, it's a good point that is just a secondary point, we find that even in CIP and CIF, you've got the buyer insuring, not realizing quite. So sometimes you'll have both parties insuring the same leg of carriage, which is just a general point that you might want to check. But yes, under CPT, the rules are silent.
So the buyer will do it.
Well, one party may have a global insurance policy. There may be all kinds of variations. There may be local insurance requirements. There could be a number of factors that go into that. But you're right to raise it, that unless the parties are, that's part of the things that aren't covered outside of CIP and CIF. Anyway, okay, yes, so all the concerns about the C rules, I have made them abundantly clear. Okay, so now we've moved from the C to the D. And the D is a bit simpler because at the bottom, insert named place of destination. Well, we're back in the world that makes sense where delivery and destination, here destination is the place of delivery. In the earlier X works and the F terms, you insert the named place of delivery. So whatever you see in the parentheses, other than the C, is going to be where delivery is. So D, now we're all the way in the world where not only does the seller have to contract for the carriage or arrange the carriage all the way to New York, but if that ship sinks, if there's damage to the goods while the ship is going along, that is going to be the responsibility of the seller. And we can see it, again, we're back in the world that makes sense because the line of cost and the line of risk is the same color, which we like that, and if it isn't, we know we're in the C terms. Look at the black box. Where are the goods? They're all the way over, right? But they're not unloaded. They're sitting in that truck. Okay, just remember that for what we're coming to. And here, just an explanation, any mode of transport. Okay, delivery when seller places the goods at the disposal, not unloaded. And the picture backs you up there. You see the goods are sitting not unloaded. Seller pays transport. The breakdown of export-import is the typical thing. And we still have that thing that if you're not specific enough, seller may select the point even at the destination in New York, all the way in New York, where that best suits its purpose. So now we're at DPU. Remember, this used to be DAT. This used to be delivered at terminal. The reason we created it was so that there was a D term where the seller has to unload. That's what's going on here. And the drawing shows you beautifully the goods have been unloaded, delivery has happened, and the goods are unloaded. And the rest of it we see is as one would expect. And here, new, the name has changed, but the principle remains the same. So if you're deciding between DAP and DPU, the issue is, should the seller unload the goods? That's the issue. Any mode of transport, delivery when seller unloads the goods from the arriving means of transport and then places them at the disposal, name place of destination, seller pays transport, our export-import allocation as per usual, and the no specific place. So again, seller gets a lot of power in deciding that place or point within the place, and if you want that to be specific, then you need to be specific. Okay, so I talked earlier about how we had received an increasing chorus of suggestions that we get rid of X works, which is all the way at one end of the spectrum. Let me step back and just give you a little piece of context for a minute. We regularly get asked, which I think is a good question, but we cannot answer it, how many, what's the right way of putting this? What are the most frequently used Incoterms rules? How often are such and such rules used? And it would be such an interesting thing to know, right? I mean, the world contracting, it would be very interesting. But if, as we know, everybody is, all around the world is using the Incoterms, and as we stand here like a heartbeat, people are concluding contracts of sale with Incoterms rules all over the world, there's no real mechanism for having a central repository of, of who's using what rule. But we were interested in the question, and so between 2010 and the time we started revising and preparing for 2020, we did a very unscientific survey. I mean, it's just the mechanism that we use. We used like SurveyMonkey or something. And we went out to all of our national committees and our members, and we asked them, what rules are you using? We set up all the rules, and we said, are you a seller or are you a buyer? And we had a few more questions. It was very simple. And we got a lot of answers. We got, I think, over 500 responses. But we did get answers from all over the world, but sometimes we would get one answer from a country or two answers, whereas, Germany and Austria, some countries that were very close to us and close to ICC, we got a disproportionate number of answers. Anyway, so in that sense, not at all unscientific. And we found some interesting and encouraging, but also alarm bell ringing things. One of the alarm bell ringing things was that XWorks was very widely used, very, very, very. That alone was a problem because we know that it has these problems. We've talked about the loading and the export problems, but also it was being used very, very often by both sellers and buyers. And just on a kind of general note, we thought, how can that be that the same really extreme rule is helpful to both both sides of a transaction? It felt really bad. So this convinced us further, problems, and then we did have a space for people to tell us about their problems. There were many problems, and a lot of them came up under XWorks, and a lot of them came up all the way at the other end of the spectrum, DDP. Right, so we have the proposal to chop the front end of this off, and DDP is not without its risks as well. So what I would ask is, if you find yourself in a DDP situation, either being proposed to you or actually in a contract, be careful, and it's pretty concentrated. See, I wish I've got to change that. The export and import formality, little, whatever those are, pieces of paper, you can't see the colors well enough, but the problem with DDP, is that it requires the seller to clear for import. Okay, up until now, and except for XWorks, where there's no obligation of anybody to do anything like that, everything except for DDP is seller deals with export, buyer import. Again, kind of makes sense because they will be familiar with the people and the rules and the players and the places. Not so with DDP. This extends the seller's obligation into the potentially impossible territory of doing import clearance in a foreign country. There are countries, and I have to admit, I don't know if Pakistan is among them. I didn't check that, I apologize. There are countries where it is explicitly by law forbidden to have people without a legal presence in the country do import clearance. So some people, a seller might agree to DDP with only a partial knowledge. I'm happy to do everything, I'm happy to take control of the whole thing, only to find late in the process that they are at risk of holding up the transaction because they do not have the proper qualifications or contacts, or they need to hire an agent or whatever it is, or establish some kind of presence. So risk is big for a seller here. Otherwise, the other things on this slide make sense. The drawings make sense. Now, let's just, I got to click back. Look at where that black box is, DDP, right? You think of XWorks, lease seller, DDP, most seller. I've just talked a bit about, and it's so heavy on the seller they have to do import, but what don't they have to do? It's kind of weird. It's like really big, but they don't have to unload. Only under DPU do you have to do the unloading. So you're really on the hook with DDP with this terrible import clearance that really might hold you up, but at least you don't have to unload the goods. Anyway, so that's just sort of, people point that out sometimes, it's like, that feels funny. Another thing, we've changed the name from DAT to DPU, we've also switched the order. Now DAT, the current DPU comes after DAP because it's one step further. You've got to unload the goods. Then you get to DDP, you have to do the import clearance, but you don't have to unload. That's the if you can call that a silver lining, I suppose. Okay, so.
Excuse me.
Yes.
I just want to know that under your D term.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, under the 3 E terms.
The XWork.
D terms,
yes.
D terms. What could be the transport document? The transport document.
How do you mean? How would it be
I mean
different?
to say that what transport document should be used under D terms? The bill of lading or multimodal?
Oh, you mean, I see. Well, let's take a look at the language of delivery document, shall we? I assume you're meaning for delivery purposes. I assume you mean for delivery document purposes. So let's have a look. Okay, we haven't talked about this provision much. Let's go, I'm trying to think, should we go in the annex? No, let's go, we'll pick DAP, and let's go through to the A6, B6 provisions, and they're pretty spare. A6, so this is the seller's obligation under DAP. Seller must provide buyer with any document required to enable the buyer to take over the goods. And B6 is very spare. The buyer must accept the document provided under A6. Hang on, I think this is a pretty dramatic reduction from what we had in 2010 in terms of listing things. Hang on. Refreshing my recollection from 2010. No. It's the same. Okay, there were some places where we had a potential list of documents. It may have just been in some drafts. You know, we'd have parentheses, such as, and we'd start listing the different kinds of things that might satisfy this, and then we decided that that was too dangerous because there's always the chance people would say, well, wait, it's not on the list. But anyway, so that's the Incoterms question. It may be tied to some other question that relates to a bank. Please. Or feel free to use this.
Even if you see the carriage side, they have mentioned that, for example, DDP, the seller must contract or arrange at its cost for the carriage of the goods to the named place of destination or to the agreed point. So it all depends on what is the agreed point. So if your agreed point is port, then it is the bill of lading. So it all depends on the carriage of the goods and the end destination that you are talking about. If it all depends on what is the destination point you have agreed. No, my dear. First of all, first thing is what destination we are talking about, and then keeping in mind destination that will be, it may be a sea and a road leg. That is I am trying to say to you that first of all you have to finalize the destination.
May I answer that?
If that destination is finalized, then that can be covered.
May I answer that? Since we are learning those Incoterms where all modes of transport are acceptable, those Incoterms that can be used for any mode of transport, any transport document related to a specific mode of transport is acceptable. It could be BL, it could be area bill, could be consignment note, or it could be multimodal transport document. So up till now we have studied only those Incoterms where all four modes of transport are acceptable. So any transport document is acceptable, whether it's BL, it's area bill, it's rail consignment note, road consignment notes, or multimodal transport document.
Thank you for this, and thank you everybody. This is raising interesting questions in my mind, because you've just made the distinction between multimodal and maritime, and that there would be requirements, and I know how we can investigate this together, because I do admit I can't remember off the top of my head. Let's go to the annex and just quickly skim through all the A6, because that will show us if there are variations. The C rules, for example, have longer provisions. And so I am in the annex. I am going to A6, which is, where am I? 156, I hear. Thank you very much. Indeed, delivery transport document. Okay. So, all right, X works. Haha, no obligation. Right, so the D terms are short, the C are longer. I'm trying to see if there's any specificity. CFR, CIF. You know, one thing actually, I'm thinking out loud here, and I apologize. If you go to CFR in this annex, and also CIF, and you look at the last part about when such a transport document is issued in negotiable form and in several originals, set of originals must be presented. I've heard comments that that language doesn't make any sense in the multimodal, but we have it in the multimodal. I don't know if that's true. I have to think about that. I just had someone draw that to my attention, because we have it in
Well,
CPT also.
In CFR or FOB or FAS, CIF, when the C mode of transport is used, only bill of lading is the transport document, and against all four mode of transport, only the bill of lading can be a negotiable instrument. Other transport documents with other mode of transport are not negotiable documents. In multimodal transport, if C is included, that transport document can be negotiable. And if C is not included, that transport document cannot be negotiable instrument.
Okay, so that's really helpful. In fact, right, so we should, instead of just repeating exactly the same language, we should make that distinction that only where it's a maritime document will it even be relevant in CPT. Okay, thank you. Anyway, sorry, got a little hijacked there, but very useful discussion. Thank you for that question. Okay, I'm trying to think. I think that we have we're a few minutes early, but I think here's a natural breaking point. We have a coffee break, a tea break rather, excuse me. And we come back. Oh yes, please, here, why don't we?
Answer his question which he asked in the start of the session on the money laundering. Okay? That was bit hijacked. So I will give you the answer. If you see that in trade-based money laundering, there are two different or three aspects. One is the money laundering piece where people can send the money, which is then the second piece is the terrorist financing. Okay. Money laundering is a different thing. Terrorist financing is totally different thing. In terrorist financing, you can also use legitimate funds also. Okay, that can happen with your legal funds. Then the third aspect is the sanctions. Okay, so these are the three different aspects that we have to check. And through these, basically people are using trade transactions to remit those funds. It is the same thing like people remitting funds through clean payments. That does not mean that the clean payments have some issues. In the same manner, the trade finance, whether it is Incoterms, whether it is an LC, does not have any issue, but people are using it. For that, we need to look into those red flags that we are talking about to ensure that whether these transactions have some linkages relating to trade-based money laundering or not. It may be possible that they can use Incoterms to increase the price, because if you see the Incoterms, there are various Incoterms. So every Incoterms have some loading of cost. So but usually we will not go to that level. It can happen that rather than using FOB, they can use the Incoterm, which is the most loaded one, to send more money out of the country. So these are certain red flags that we have to see, but it does not mean that these Incoterms or LCs or collections they are sometimes misused, which can be you can misuse anything. Okay, this glass is used for drinking, but you can throw it away on somebody's face also. So that does not mean that this glass is. So we have to look into that aspect, that trade-based money laundering is a thing where we need to have different things need to be looked to ensure that this thing is not happening. They have already issued this thing, yeah. If you read the ICC guidelines that we have issued in 2017 and 19 also, that gives you the entire thing the bank has to do during the life cycle of the transaction. What you have to do at the time of, because the most important thing in everything is how you understand your customer. The understanding of the customer is the most important thing, and understanding of his business. Okay, so the KYC, whether it is a trade or it is a non-trade, KYC is the most important document. So for trade, we have to do high level of KYC to understand better about the customer, his business and the products. So that is so we have given in that document that what bank has to do at the time of onboarding, what he has to do at the time of issuing a wealthy, payments, and delivery of documents. So if you go through that document, that will be a good thing for you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Interesting discussion. Okay, yes, so tea break, coffee break, break of some kind, and come back, please, in 15 minutes, I believe?
Yes, please.
Yes.
15 minutes.
Exactly. Okay, good. See you in 15.